Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, it was a decision that had been trailed for some days, and yesterday it was announced that the government is to allow increases in public sector pay of above 1% for the first time since 2010. Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon announced an easing of the cap in Scotland last week. But what exactly is the Chancellor planning to do for public sector workers? Here's Emma with the details.
Thanks, Jo. Philip Hammond says ministers will now get flexibility to breach the 1% pay cap. Police officers will get a 1% rise plus a one-off bonus of 1%. And prison officers will receive a 1.7% rise. Now, both these rises will be funded through existing budgets, so the money will have to come from cuts elsewhere or financial reserves. Unions reacted angrily to the pay awards, branding them a real terms cut, with inflation currently running at 2.9%. Mark Sawatka, General Secretary of the Public and Commercial Services Union, called the deal a pile of crap. And TUC General Secretary Francis O'Grady called the offer pathetic. But Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Liz Truss, says the plans will give government departments greater leeway to address pinch points in public sector staffing and take steps towards tackling recruitment, retention and staff morale. The pay settlements for the other parts of the public sector, such as for the NHS, staff and teachers, is yet to be decided, but expect pressure to mount for the government to end the public sector pay cap across the board. Jo.
Thank you very much, Emma. Samjima, is this the end of the public sector pay cap?
No, we've still got a deficit, and we've made great strides. The deficit as a percent of GDP was 48% in 2010, is now 42%. What we're doing now recognises the sacrifice that public sector workers have made, and the fact that 1% is too stringent, specifically where we've got recruitment and retention.
So is it the end of the public sector pay cap at 1%?
In strategic cases, and we'll be looking for flexibility, absolutely.
Right, in strategic cases. So that means a euphemism for what? In areas where it's been difficult to recruit people?
So prison officers, I have responsibility for prisons, we have recruitment issues, we have retention issues, and we're trying to recruit 2,500 new officers by the end of 2018. It makes sense in that context to look at the issue of pay, especially where the independent peer review body came up with a recommendation that we accepted in full.
But not for everybody. You don't think there should be, or it should be allowed for ministers to breach the 1% pay cap for all public sector workers?
I think we should. I mean, what we did is we went with the independent peer review body's recommendation.
Yeah, and they're guided by the government.
That is what we should be doing. But there are some. I mean, I think flexibility is what you need. There are some parts of the public sector where, if you look at pension arrangements, if you look at progression pay, and all of that, you may actually treat the issue quite differently to the way that we've dealt with prison officers and police officers.
Right, but when you say they deserve a pay rise in your department and for prison officers, it's not a pay rise, is it? How much more money are they going to be earning when you take inflation into account, which is at 2.9%?
Yes. Well, as I said, we accepted the independent peer review body's recommendations in full. Inflation at the time that the pay cap was extended in 2015 was about 1.7%, and now it's about 2.9%, right. Mainly because of the devaluation of sterling.
Right. It's not a pay rise then, is it?
The OBR forecast that inflation will drop. So it is a recognition of the sacrifices that have been made. But you've also got to remember that alongside this, there's also been the raising the personal allowance, which has increased take-home pay. So while the headline rate, salary rate hasn't gone up, we've actually helped increase take-home pay by raising the personal allowance.
Right, but Samjima, public sector workers have had 2 years of a pay freeze. They then had 5 years of pay capped at 1%, albeit some workers getting increments at work. Their incomes have been squeezed as inflation's gone up, and now, as we have agreed, it's 2.9%. Is this or is this not a pay rise when you're giving prison officers 1.7%?
It is an increase in pay. I do agree with you that our wages are under extreme pressure. But there is a difference between our position and what I believe the Labour Party's position will be, which is that we still have a deficit. We've still got to work on reducing it, whereas Labour would like to pretend that there is no limit to the amount of money that is available to spend on this.
Tracy, where would you put the pay rise?
Can I just say it's heartbreaking having to listen to you, because we, nurses, midwives, firefighters paying the price of bankers, it's just not right.
All right, so where would you put it? Well, hang on, Tracy.
And how do you actually face the prison officers that come to you and you're giving them 50p extra a day, and actually, incrementally with inflation, it's actually a pay cut.
All right, so tell us, where would you set the pay rise?
What the Labour Party have said is that we will lift this pay cap because it is unfair, and these people who are, people who keep up our society, midwives, as I said, nurses, firefighters, they deserve a proper pay.
Which is how much?
Which we were talking also that we would. There are figures said that 5%. I don't know. It would not be.
Let's take 5%. That's what the unions are asking for. But Tracy, is the Labour Party? Do you support a 5%, an inflation busting 5% rise for all public sector workers?
What I support absolutely is fair pay for a fair day's work, and they are not getting that at the moment.
Fine,
and that
you've
is
said
why,
that, but what we need to know,
this conversation.
When you're criticising the government, we need to know what Labour is actually offering. Are you saying you would back 5% pay rises?
Well, my sister's a nurse. I would back 5% myself, because I know what job she does and how extraordinary the job is, and that some of her colleagues are going to food banks. It's unacceptable.
Right, what about teachers?
What I would say is that we do back negotiations, and we do back the fact that this pay cap must be lifted, and you cannot set sector against sector. It's unfair and disingenuous.
All right, well, let's take the 5%. Do you know how much that would cost a year to fund?
My understanding is it's 40 billion.
40 billion till?
It's per year. Is my understanding. Those figures may be wrong, so you must excuse me.
Well, it wouldn't be 40 billion a year to fund those pay rises. I mean, the Institute for Fiscal Studies said it would cost £9.2 billion per year by 2021-22 to increase public sector pay in line with inflation. Which,
Thank you for that clarity.
OK,
it's not just a thing.
Hang on.
If you're going to do that, you've then got to ask yourself whether people will not lose their jobs. Because if you can't afford that amount of money, the consequence of it is that you lose your job. One of the benefits.
But we are losing jobs. Nurses.
Well, hang on. Unemployment figures. Yeah, but hang on. Unemployment figures are at their lowest level since 1975. We've just had new jobless figures out, and actually they're at something like 4.3%. That is a record high in terms of employment, a record low in terms of unemployment.
So and in-work poverty is rising. It is about the quality of the jobs, the gig economy, the minimum wage, the people using food banks. This is not, whilst we celebrate people in work, it's the quality of the work that's important.
And actually, Sam Jima, when you talk about the fact that this is actually recognising people's sacrifices, and you criticise Labour for saying that those sorts of pay rises would mean people losing their jobs, you are going to fund these pay rises through cuts in departmental spending, which could result in police cuts.
Well, as we said, there is still a deficit. We still believe that we can't just pick the pockets of the next generation to fund.
So you're going to pick the pockets of the police department to give some officers a pay rise.
And there is money for the DUP. There is a magic monetary.
Let him speak.
We've got to think of smarter ways of doing what we do. At the MOJ, we're constantly looking at where we can use technology better, how we can restructure services, and all those things are things that we've got.
Are you saying there are more back office savings to be made in departments that have had cuts made to them since 2010? 14% cuts to police budgets, even bigger cuts in your department to the prison service. Listen, you're asking them to make further cuts to fund these pay, and they're not rises when you take inflation into account, to fund these pay increases versus inflation out of departmental spending.
It is a tough situation to be in, but the truth is we can't spend money we just don't have. And that's and sort of just listening to Tracy here, a lot of your position is based on spending money that is simply not available.
Right, are you saying we don't spend money all the time that we don't have? I mean, where did you find the money for the DUP?
Well, the issue with the DUP is I think this is quite laughable. Any party which would have formed a government would have had to do a deal with the DUP. Conservatives or Labour.
Right, but you yourself have just said we're running a £45 billion deficit. That is what a deficit is. So when you say we're spending money we don't have, that's what we're doing.
But it means you make strategic choices. So we
to harm public sector workers.
So we made a choice that meant that people stayed in work rather than people getting laid off because pay raced out of control. Now we're in a position where, having reduced the deficit from 48 to 42%, you can, in strategic cases, relax that pay cap. Now, I'd like to hear a Labour proposal that is inflation busting and can still keep people in work and can still balance the books.
Right. I mean, Tracy, you can't have your cake and eat it. We have £1.7 trillion worth of debt, a £45 billion of deficit, and you want to add to that borrowing by £9.2 billion a year to 2021-22 to have an inflation-busting pay rise for public sector workers.
I think it's about political will. It's where do you want to put your money? And I think that...
You want to put it on future generations.
I would say that we need... When Sam says that we need to keep people in work, we have a complete hemorrhaging of teachers, of nurses. This is not the way to keep public sector in work at all. And it's making them pay the biggest price for governmental mistakes.
We're going to leave it there.
Now, following the government's announcement that the 1% cap on pay for police and prison officers have been lifted, there are increasing calls for it to be extended to NHS workers.
Joining us from Central London, Josie Irwin, who's Head of Employment Relations at the Royal College of Nursing. Josie, a very good afternoon to you. I wonder if you heard what the Prime Minister had to say at the Prime Minister's questions, that there would be a new flexible approach to the public sector pay cap.
I didn't hear her at Prime Minister's question time, but I read the announcement yesterday and heard that that was the plan. We are very interested, nurses are very interested in what exactly the government mean by flexible, and we're inclined to agree with the comments made by John Ashworth and others that if this means taking money from others to pay for NHS staff, nurses and/or others, that would be a very, very divisive
So where should the money come from, Josie? Where should it come from? General taxation? Perhaps we could raid the foreign aid budget. Where should it come from?
Well, I was interested listening to the conversations just now about industrial action and whether unions will take strike or not. The RCN has gone on record and said we'll consider industrial action if the cap isn't lifted. But actually, look at the impact of the pay cap. There are 40,000 nursing vacancies.
44,000?
40,000 vacancies across England alone, which NHS trusts are having to fill using agency staff, which costs more money. That could be saved by paying more than the 1% cap and actually recruiting nurses to give the patient care that they want to give. So that's where some of the money could come from, rather than robbing Peter to pay Paul.
That figure is an interesting one, isn't it? People will look at that figure of 40,000 vacancies in the NHS and say for nurses, and they say, well, that exemplifies the problem here. If you're not paying enough, you won't get the people. But it presupposes that it's just about pay. Life tends to be more complicated than just pay, doesn't it? There may be lots of reasons why people don't want to go into nursing.
Of course, that's the case, and we hear stories from our members of working in very difficult circumstances, heavy workload, but all of that is compounded by the fact that there aren't enough staff, and the root cause is actually money and how much people are paid, and you can't get away from that. Of course, it's a complex range of reasons, but pay is at the heart of things.
Should all nurses, whichever type of nursing job they do, in whichever part of the country they work in, get the same pay rise?
Why not?
Because
nurses.
Well, I only asked the question because it seems, I remember my mother's days as working as a nurse. There were some jobs, some hospitals which were tougher than others. There were some disciplines within nursing which were harder than others. There are some parts of the country you would imagine which are harder to work in than others. This idea of approaching a one-size-fits-all approach to salaries might seem odd.
I think any nurse who works in the community or in a hospital environment would dispute that. And whether a nurse is working
Which bit? There are significant differences between jobs.
Well, whether a nurse is working in Newcastle, hands-on, in a busy accident and emergency ward, or whether a nurse is working in the community dealing with fragile elderly people.
Yeah.
The care that's given is the same quality and it demands the same pay rate.
The same, right? Okay. Because I mean, the comparison obviously with the private sector
because they're paid for what they're paid for what they do, not for where they live. And actually, the cost of childcare is likely to be just the same in Newcastle as it is in Exeter.
That is a good point. Just the point on the comparison with the private sector. I mean, obviously in the private sector, you don't have to say anything like the same degree, the same collective bargaining, national collective bargaining. And it's also made the point, isn't it, that actually, okay, the days of fantastic public sector pensions are over. Nonetheless, there is still a 10% pay gap between like-for-like jobs in the private and public sector.
Across the piece, yes, but in terms of healthcare and nurses specifically, pay increases in the private sector are currently running 2 to 3% ahead of pay increases in the public sector. And in relation to the NUS, the NHS, so the figure that you've quoted is a general figure rather than relating to nursing.
Okay, Josie, Irwin, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Back to the UK now. The Labour Party has called on the government to lift the 1% pay cap on public sector workers for all workers after it was announced that police officers will get an average 2% increase and prison officers a rise of 1.7%. Theresa May told MPs during Prime Minister's questions a little earlier that there was some flexibility, that was the word she used, on the issue, but balance was needed between pay and fairness to taxpayers. These are some of the numbers involved. Pay for public sector workers, that includes those in the NHS, police, prison service, teachers, costs more than £150 billion every year. Increasing the pay of all the workers costs the public finances something like £1.5 billion for every percentage point it goes up. An inflation matching pay rise of 2.9% across the board, that would cost something like £5 billion a year. The National Police Chiefs Council said the extra 1% announced for officers, their officers, will cost £50 million, something forces actually haven't necessarily budgeted for. They say police officer pay makes up around 50% of total force budgets, which have had real terms cuts of 18% since 2010. This was rejected by the policing minister, coincidentally Nick Hurd, who said the offer was affordable to forces and claimed that some of those forces are sitting on at least £1.5 billion in reserves. The largest part of the public sector workforce, something like 30% of the total, are NHS employees. The NHS spends around £40 billion a year on what are described as frontline staff. During the election campaign, Labour said it would ensure the NHS wages rose at the same rate as private sector pay, which would cost something like £2.9 billion a year. So that's some of the context. What about the ideology? Can the country afford a pay rise across the public sector? We're joined by Daniel Marnie, Head of Economics Research at the Centre for Policy Studies, and Faiza Shaheen, Director of the Centre for Labour and Social Studies. A very good afternoon to both of you. Mr Marnie, let's start with you if we can. As our graphic just illustrated then, a relatively modest pay increase for an individual has a commensurately huge impact on the public finances.
Indeed, and I think the public sector pay cap has been an essential policy for two main reasons. So after the financial crisis, we had a huge budget deficit, so that needed to come down. And also, public sector pay was much higher than private sector pay. There was a very, very huge differential there. So I think that was a very essential policy. Now, going forward, I think Theresa May is right to say there should be some flexibility, but I think there needs to be perhaps a modest increase, and of course that needs to be paid for, and I don't think it can be paid for via borrowing, and it shouldn't be paid for through increased taxes either.
Faiza, the problem is one person's modest is not enough for many people, is it? How do we set about defining what is realistic, affordable for the public purse, but what actual individuals and trades unions, as importantly, actually want?
Yeah, I think we're coming into this debate from the wrong perspective, actually. Let's look at it from a personal perspective. So those workers in the public sector, from our nurses, our teachers, the people that really keep the wheels on society, they've seen real-term cuts for 7 years. And this comes from a problem created by bankers who saw their wages go back to normal after a few years. So you can imagine the sense of unfairness. These people work very, very hard for us. And they are seeing their household budgets cut by thousands, really, up to 2020 when you take it that far. These are real term cuts. And what we've heard is just simply not even a half measure today. It doesn't match what inflation is, so people are still getting real term cuts. And at the societal level, so we tend to think about this, and we've come into this debate sort of saying, oh, we just don't have the money. We have to remember, one, that we found the money when we wanted to buy off the DUP. That magic money tree apparently does exist.
And also that was a billion pounds, wasn't it?
Yes, it was £1 billion, but that is a big sum of money still. I mean, one of the things that you would say is that we have had an incorrect debate about the way in which government budgets work. When these people will get a pay rise, they will spend more in the economy. Unlike when you give tax breaks to the richest, who then don't spend it, save it, put it away in tax havens, etc. They will spend it in the economy. That generates more growth, and that generates more tax take for the government. So actually, there is a very strong economic argument as well as a social argument for this.
OK, Daniel, do you accept the point? I think Pfizer used the phrase, these are the people who keep the wheels on society. Do you accept that the pay gap that exists, and by some analyses it's about 10%, that you earn 10% less in the private sector compared to the public sector, is justifiable because of the nature of the jobs that some of these people do?
Well, when you account for worker characteristics, there is still a benefit to being a public sector worker. So you're still earning 4% more, and that doesn't even include any of the pension benefits. So I think that is important to note. I think, as I said, I think there could be some loosening for public sector pay, but if we go with what the unions say, which is 5% across the board, that would be incredibly dangerous. So there'd be massive inflationary pressures, interest rates would rise, the confidence of the government would fall, government borrowing costs would increase, and then you would have a slowdown in the economy, and that would be good for absolutely no one. So the government needs to make sure it doesn't give in to this pressure while making sure that, some loosening can happen in certain areas.
Pfizer, just on the point that the unions make when they talk about, and you talk about some of the frontline workers in the public sector, we tend to focus on quite emotive figures, don't we, the firefighters, the nurses. Public sector payroll is full of jobs that are less emotive, the people working in the back office, etc. But the unions still want to have the collective bargaining for all of them. In the private sector, of course, it works very differently, doesn't it? If you do a job that's more hectic in a less desirable place, you'll be paid more by the company for doing that. It doesn't seem to work that way in the public sector, should it?
Look, frontline staff depend on people in the office to get out, the logistics, etc. All of us know that in the working environment, we need the administrative support, etc.
But should they all
this
enjoy
is a classic
the same
thing,
pay
though.
rise?
No, I'm sorry. This is a classic thing that happens. We pit public sector workers against private sector workers. That's not what should happen here. Essentially, all workers, and the average worker in particular, haven't seen pay rises for really a long time now, even before the financial crisis. And what's happened is that we've seen a decade of wage growth. We haven't seen it so poor for 200 years. And there's obviously something fundamentally wrong in the economy, and that's true for public sector and private sector workers. What people do is they compare apples with pears and start saying, oh, well, private sector workers, you should be upset with public sector workers, and public sector workers are getting a good deal. Actually, no. Actually, a lot of people in the economy are not getting a good deal. We're talking about public sector today because actually, when you think about it, if we are unable to give the people that matter so much in society a decent pay package, then we are obviously getting something fundamentally wrong in our economy, guys, whether that's about how much tax we raise or elsewhere. And this is costing huge amounts of money. The lack of retention, etc., is storing up huge costs for the future.
Apologies, we've got to cut this one short, I'm afraid. Faiza Shaheen and Daniel Marley, thanks both very much indeed for your time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
New figures out today show that the number of people in work in Britain has jumped again to hit a new record. Theresa May told MPs it was the result of her government's sound management of the economy. But the employment numbers coincide with the latest assessment of what's happening to wages. Well, they remained below the rate of inflation, which means earnings don't go as far as they used to. Labour's Jeremy Corbyn says that means that millions in work are struggling to pay their bills. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar.
Do you want the good news or the bad news? Because today there's both. In plants, factories all around the country, more people are in work now than we've seen in decades. A strong jobs market, according to latest figures. News made to measure for a government eager to talk up any sign of British success.
Has austerity had its day, Prime Minister?
The answer's no. There's plenty more austerity ahead and trouble coming on public sector pay. So today, Theresa May took the jobs figures to Westminster and got her retaliation in first.
Unemployment at lowest levels since the mid-1970s. And employment, people in work, people taking home a wage, a salary to support their families at record levels.
The only problem is more people in work are in poverty than ever before, more are in insecure work, more relying on tax credits and housing benefit to make ends meet.
Today's figures show that unemployment fell by 75,000 from May to July. That brings the jobless rate down to 4.3%, the lowest since 1975. Wages are up 2.1% on the previous year. But with inflation hitting 2.9%, in real terms, wages are still failing to keep up. At Westminster, that only added to the pressure on the Prime Minister to hand all public sector workers, not just the police and prison officers, a rise above the 1% pay cap, and a bigger one than the 2% and under already announced. Mrs May was back on the theme. She had to guard every penny.
We need to ensure that we balance out protecting jobs in the public sector, being fair to public sector workers, and being fair to taxpayers who pay for it, many of whom are public sector workers. There is a need for greater flexibility as we look at these issues of public sector pay in the future. We will be working on this in the lead up to the budget.
So a clear hint, public sector workers would get more, but not much, and not nearly enough for Labour's leader.
Does the Prime Minister understand that inflation is now 2.9%? Anything less means that dedicated public servants are worse off again, and they've been made worse off every year for the past 7 years.
As it is, extra police and prison pay will have to come out of savings in police and prison spending. The news left few people happy. It could even cost jobs.
This is not funded by the government and has got to be found from existing resources. And the only way we can do that is reducing the number of police officers that we have. In our case, it'll reduce the number by 60.
Hold course, treat all public sector workers the same as police, and ministers could start looking lonely and exposed. Pay deals meant to attract vital recruits may please no one and leave people wondering who'd want the job of Prime Minister just now. So the government needs all the good economic news that it can get and more. The worry is the squeeze on the value of pay could drive down consumer spending and hold back the economy. Not a happy background, with the struggle for a Brexit that works for Britain still ahead and a bitter combat over public pay now looking close at hand. Hugh.
John, thank you very much.
The government suffered a defeat on NHS pay in the House of Commons this afternoon, a defeat that seems to have significantly changed parliamentary convention. It came amid a row over claims that the Prime Minister made about police pay during Prime Minister's questions. Our political correspondent Michael Crick joins us now from Westminster. Michael.
Yes, John. Well, the House of Commons this afternoon formally decided to scrap the pay cap in the NHS and to give NHS workers a pay rise. Only the motion is not at all binding, so they may not be getting the pay rise that they're expecting from that motion. What happened is the government decided not to oppose Labour's motion because the government knew they were going to lose. The reason why the government was going to lose, the Democratic Unionists from Northern Ireland, who formally support the government when it comes to votes of confidence and budget matters, decided that on this issue they were going to back Labour. So there was no vote and the motion simply sailed through. What's more, government sources tonight are making it clear that in future, when Labour put down motions that they don't like, they may well tell their MPs simply not to vote, simply really to ignore the motion and the debate. This, the day after the House of Commons voted to give the government an inbuilt majority on the legislative committees that are scrutinising legislation as it goes through the Commons. Well, Labour have described tonight's announcement by the government as disgraceful and undemocratic, a move that shows the Tory government has abandoned respect for parliamentary democracy.
Meanwhile, what did Theresa May say about police pay today?
Well, at Prime Minister's question, she said that some police, those who joined the force in 2010, had actually, thanks to tax cuts and pay rises since then, had a real terms pay rise of 32%. This is how she came to that figure.
A calculation suggests that a new police officer in 2010, thanks to progression pay and annual basic salary increases and the increase in the personal allowance that is a tax cut for people, have actually seen an increase in their pay of over £9,000 since 2010, a real terms increase of 32%.
Well, the Vice Chairman of the Police Federation, Callum MacLeod, called that a joke and a downright lie. He said that in real terms, police have had a pay cut of 16%. A couple of hours later, though, he'd rather modified his language.
That's a bit disingenuous when you look at the police service as a whole. The police service as a whole has a real term reduction in salaries of 16%. Police officers need to be fairly paid for the job they do on behalf of the public. They take risks on behalf of the public. That needs to be recognised.
And as if Theresa May hasn't got enough problems right now, an extraordinary threat from her former Minister, George Osborne, whom she sacked, you'll recall, when she became Prime Minister last year, to murder her. In a profile in Esquire magazine, a couple of people who know Mr. Osborne say that they've heard him say that he will not rest until Theresa May is, quote, chopped up in bags in my freezer. And now it seems that Mr. Osborne is planning to visit the Conservative Party conference in 3 weeks' time. Should be interesting.
Michael Crick.
Jenny Cleman, Stig Abel are here. It is to that story you want to start, but on the front page of the Times, Britain races towards the top after record job numbers revealed.
I think this is such an important story because it goes to the very heart of how we're run as a country, how our economy is run. And what we've had for the last several years is this fetishisation of full employment. Whereas whatever's been going on in the economy, particularly outside of London, the Conservative governments that we've had have said, look at the employment figures, look at the employment figures. Theresa May did it again in Prime Minister's questions. Jeremy Corbyn says, why are you screwing over the public sector? She stands up and says, what about the employment figures? And we're supposed to feel, and economists would have told us for centuries to feel, if there's low unemployment, things must be going well. And they're not. It's a misleading statistic. There's lots of people in this country who are in low-wage jobs, they're in part-time jobs, they're in self-employed jobs, they're in zero-contract jobs that do not pay their way. The majority, I think, of people in absolute poverty are working. And it's very hard to get our heads around that collectively, but it's really, really important that we do, because it means people are expending energy, vast amounts of energy, working hard, doing long-hour jobs, and at the end of it, they can't earn enough to live by. And that's the economy we've been left with. People, there's lots of people doing very well, but there's an awful lot of people who are working hard and being penalised by the current economic system. So the government will tell you, look at this effectively full employment, we must have a successful economy. And the answer is, that is not the way of measuring successful economies.
Yeah, so two questions. What is driving down wages? And are they in any way helped, as Theresa May also pointed out in PMQs today, by the changing of the minimum threshold at which you start paying tax, so taking more people effectively out of tax?
Well, the fact is that wages are lower than they were a year ago because of inflation, and their wages are no higher than they were 11.5 years ago. And in a market like this, when there are record numbers of employed people, they should be going up. Why is that happening? It's because the economy isn't doing that well. That's the whole point. And these numbers, you can't read too much into these figures. It's great that there are more people in employment, but it's quite a binary thing, measurement of are you employed versus not, rather than are you employed in a way that actually helps you. And I think most people do not feel that the economy is doing well, despite figures like this.
And that's a tragedy. I mean, it's tragic. These are tragic figures, that there could be this number of people in employment who are not paying their way. Their work is not working for them. And it masks all sorts of other inequalities. Effectively, London has done all right since 2008 when the financial crash happened, even though it happened in London. Every single other area in Britain is poorer in GDP terms than it was 10 years ago. The country as a whole is not prospering, but there's just enough to paper over the cracks. So look, we've got full employment. Look, house prices have more or less retained their value. Neither one of those things actually helps people who are at the lower end of the scale.
But actually, you know, it's ironic that it is today, 10 years ago, that the queues began outside Northern Rock.
It is.
You know, the real start for us, at least of the financial crisis, even though it had been started in
And
America
if
earlier.
10 years ago we could have known that 10 years
But
later...
people did warn about that, didn't they? The risk of deflation. Obviously,
yes, but
inflation's
this
high
idea
now,
that we are still, things are so sluggish still now, you know, it's very unfortunate, and particularly given that we are going to be leaving the EU and we are not going to have this, you know, free movement of labour, of people coming in, because, you know, we're going to need people because we have so much employment in our own country. You know, what's going to happen to our economy?
The consequences, just briefly, the consequences of 10 years ago, we all felt that maybe 5 years later they'd been dealt with. But I think even politically, so economically, we are still in serious...
Well, even quicker than that, when we came out of recession, everyone thought,
yeah,
well,
it's
that's
fine.
it.
But as I've said, the economy it's misleadingly structured now. But the political situation, Jeremy Corbyn is benefiting from the legacy of the 2008 crisis. That massive inequality that revealed, that notion that the free market hasn't worked, the notion that trickle-down economics doesn't work, all of those big ideas that sustained their way through, leading to austerity, we are now suffering the aftershocks of that. And politically we're doing it, and economically we're doing it, and people who work every day who can't afford to live are suffering from the consequences.
And Donald Trump, you might argue, in America is also
well, indeed.
on the populist vote on that.